Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to ABA GP Solo's Activate Diversities series latest program, The Responsibility and Challenge to the Legitimization of Islamophobia. My name is Henry Hamilton III, and I am chair of the ABA General Practice Solo and Small Firm Division. We are the third largest division of the American Bar Association. Our motto is "Your success is our mission," and we take that to heart. And we try to improve the administration of justice and also to ensure that the nation's solo and small firm practitioners are more efficient, more successful, and indeed more profitable. And for those working for a nonprofit or government agencies, that you're better equipped to fulfill your agency's mission. And this is the latest program, and I've been excited about this all month when I heard about it. And this is towards, decreasing those intentional and unintentional insensitivities that take away from creating those more welcome and more inclusive environments that we're trying to get to and build these DEI empowering and sustaining environments. And so, with no further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Dana King, who has worked so hard to bring you this esteemed panel, and I'm looking forward to it. All right, Dana.
Thank you. I am Dana King, and I was assigned by our chair of the diversity board. I bring you greetings on behalf of her, Miss Kelly Adams, and we are super excited about this presentation and our panelists and our moderator, who's also going to serve as a panelist. I want to introduce her to our audience, and she will introduce the remainder of the panel. Okay, so Janaan Hashim is the co-founder of Amal Law Group, the first firm in the U.S. founded by 6 Muslim women in 2007. She currently practices civil rights law. Janaan, thank you, welcome, and please introduce your fellow panelists.
Well, thank you so much, Dana, and thank you, Henry, both of you, for giving this opportunity and this platform. This platform and this opportunity to share with everyone a very important topic. And we've got an hour and a half ahead of us, but the time, you'll see, it will fly very, very quickly. We have a lot of ground to cover and some really interesting topics ahead of us. We have a really distinguished group of panelists today to discuss this topic. We're going to start off with personal experiences of being on the receiving end of Islamophobia, or running interference, if you will, as a bystander, examining what Islamophobia and anti-Muslim bias are and their sources. And then we'll take a look at this through the civil rights lens, and also address this form of hate in terms of how to take it on head on moving forward. Our panelists join us with varying backgrounds, and for the attorneys on the panel, including myself, we do share a common denominator of all being born and raised in the U.S. And I'm saying this because all too often I've encountered from even very highly educated individuals the question of, you speak such good English, where are you from? And that's our world. And that's just a small example of some of the things that we have to go through as Muslim Americans. We're from here. When we're told to go back home, it's a short trip from here to here. So that being said, in alphabetical order, it's my pleasure to introduce first, we have Junaid Afeef. He is an administrative law judge for the state of Illinois and co-founder of the Muslim Bar Association in Chicago. We have Jinan Chehade. She is a civil rights attorney and graduate of Georgetown Law. Jinan focuses on advocating for the constitutional rights of Muslims and minorities, both in the courtroom and on the ground in her community. Saman Haque is a Muslim American employment lawyer. She's based out of Chicago, and a large part of her practice involves working with employers to prevent discrimination and harassment in the workplace through trainings and enforced policies. And we have Dr. Aaron X. Smith. He is an assistant professor in the Department of Africology and African American Studies at Temple University, and he is a board member of the Molife Kiti Asante Institute at 5535 Germantown Avenue. Boy, honestly, these introductions do no justice, honestly, I'm telling you, to the myriad experiences and accomplishments that our panelists will be bringing to the table. And I encourage everyone to read through their bios provided in the program materials. I think we're going to have that in the chat if it's not already been placed there. And so on that note, welcome panelists. Thanks for joining us. The format of tonight's 90-minute seminar will be a roundtable discussion with the last 20 to 30 minutes reserved for Q&A from you, our attentive attendees. Because of this and the amount of ground we'd like to cover, I'm going to ask for y'all to please refrain from asking questions and comments until we open the floor for questions. That way we can stay focused and be able to discuss all the points that we want to raise tonight. So to get us started, I thought it would be useful to provide context to tonight's discussion by having our panelists share their own personal experience of Islamophobia or their experience as a bystander of Islamophobia. And we'll start with Saman. Can you share with us one of your experiences?
Yeah, so I think in the legal context is probably where I'll start, because I think we've all had certain experiences, small microaggressions, but the most recent I had as an attorney, where a faith-based issue came up. And I think a lot of times faith-based choices are questioned more often than other choices. So I was actually with a superior attorney traveling with them, and we had dealt with the client, went out to lunch, and he had actually, said, well, what are you drinking? And I said that I don't drink. And that raised the question of, why not? And I said, I'm actually Muslim. I choose not to because of my faith. And that started more questions. And personally, I prefer people asking me the questions as opposed to Googling things. I like having the, interactive discussion. But it very quickly turned more negative, and like, oh, well, that's very weird. And that's not something that he was, it didn't feel accepting, and it kind of went on. And then he also wanted to share some food. And I only eat Zabia halal food. And for those who don't know, on the webinar, it is when food is prepared in an Islamic way. And I'd mentioned, I can't share this food. He's like, well, what's wrong with this food now? And it was very aggressive, and I think took me back because I practice in the employment space. And this isn't something that you would think would be common from someone who also practices in the employment space. So the lunch goes on, and I get more questions about, well, why is it that you're, why do you feel so strongly about that? What's the point of it, essentially? And then we actually went back, same client, and he brought it up to the client while we were having a conversation. And out of nowhere, like, did you know that she doesn't drink? Like, isn't that odd? Like, and I think there's a tendency sometimes to otherize things. And within the Islamic faith, it's hard when people don't understand or don't come from an understanding perspective. So in that particular instance, it was difficult because you're in a professional setting, and you want to be well liked, and you want to make sure that you're getting along with your colleagues. So that's just one within the legal profession that I faced.
Junaid, I'll ask you what your experience is. Now, you can't say being questioned about what you drink and what you eat. So those two are taken for us. So what do you have to share?
Well, thank you very much, Janaan. I will take it back a little bit earlier. I was born in India, but I came to the United States when I was 4 years old. I came to the northwest suburbs of Chicago. So we're talking about 1973 onwards. And unfortunately, like my entire childhood is, scarred by Islamophobia. Growing up, being called a sand N-word, raghead, and a camel jockey was just the norm. The teachers would derisively call me and my brother and some of my cousins Abdullah. My name is Junaid Afeef. It's not Abdullah. Clearly that was meant to be, some type of derision. And growing up, our home was vandalized on a regular basis. The night that the Iran hostage crisis began, our windows were shot out. And for the next couple of years, our lawns were, our home, the lawn was driven over by cars to destroy the grass, and great expense, and we were not well off. And and then physical abuse was also the norm all the way until I finally joined the wrestling team in high school and learned to defend myself. Being beat up was just a regular thing. What really, honestly, it's something that I minimized in my adult life until I became a father. And and the first time my children came home and told me of instances where they had been otherized, and particularly because of their Muslim faith, it really came flooding back, honestly. Like I kind of, I think, psychologically minimized it and continued forward. But when I saw that my own kids were now experiencing some of the same things that I had experienced, I realized how severe this issue is. And then fast forward to the present in the legal field, I have seen Islamophobia present itself in many different ways. But what hurts most is when allies minimize the existence of it. That's what I'd like to share at this point.
All right. And Jinan, how about you? What do you have to share with us?
Yeah, thank you so much, Junaid. It's an honor to be here and to discuss this very important topic. I think for me, similar to Junaid, I've had very different overt and covert forms of Islamophobia in my life that really, that first, I think it's important to give background of where I grew up and how I grew up. I was born and raised in Bridgeview, literally known as Little Palestine on Google Maps. Everywhere you go, there are Arabic signs. It's a majority Muslim and Arab community. And yeah, it just feels like you're home. But also growing up in this community, although it did offer me a lot of perspective and culture, I also grew up in a post 9/11 age where Muslims were constantly vilified for their faith and Arabs were demonized for their background. So for me, I always grew up a kind of seeing what does it mean, kind of this clash of civilizations that was manifested, or that was supposed manifested of, constant FBI raids and surveillance on my community, mobs, literally armed mobs coming towards my mosque post 9/11. And even seeing my father, I think it was every week, washing off red paint that said terrorists on his car. So I think growing up in this community as a little girl, I constantly viewed myself in this double consciousness, right? Viewing myself how others would view me and trying to beat those stereotypes. And it was exhausting, right? And with every time my scarf was pulled off, every shooting at my community, I saw that I was constantly going to be the other in this country. And I think for me, what kind of woke me out of this despair and sense of helplessness was, I believe it was in 2014, 2015, when Dia, Yusur, and Razan, 3 American Muslims were shot point blank in Chapel Hill. And this was also coupled with the 2014 siege on Gaza, which 3,000 were killed, including, my own family at risk. So I realized in that moment, I did not have the privilege, again, to fall into despair or helplessness, that I couldn't simply expect or ask for change, that I really needed to demand it and equip myself with the tools to implement it. So that's where I decided I wanted to go to law school. Starting to sound like a diversity paper, but I apologize, it's not. But really going to law school, because my entire experience with the law was something that was constantly weaponized against my community in a way. So I wanted to instill these tools again to reclaim the law and instead empower myself and my community with the law and use it as a tool of advocacy. And now I think it's really important, and why we're having this conversation is that we are again seeing this resurgence of a post 9/11 era where Muslims are demonized in different spaces for their religion and background. And even for me, I think again, I graduated from Georgetown. For me and my family, my community, this was the biggest deal. You know, a first generation person graduating from law school. I finally felt that I had proved people wrong, that I had made it, that I had grasped this American dream I kept on hearing of. But then later I was fired for speaking and advocating for Palestinian rights and my family. And then a few months later, again, we saw Wadi al-Fayoumi, who is a 6-year-old boy from our community who was stabbed 26 times while the assailant shouted death to all Muslims. And then we saw 3 Muslim boys in Vermont who were also shot, and one of them now is paralyzed from the waist down. Last month, we saw a woman attempt to drown a 3-year-old Palestinian Muslim American with her mother watching, while saying very racist remarks. So I think as we start this conversation, I think what I really want to frame for people is really asking ourselves how we got here. And I really want people to take away that these events that I listed are only a few, but they also did not happen in a silo. So it requires us to have these conversations and to critically think of how did we get here and really where do we go from here?
And I'm going to go ahead and share with everyone my little story, and then afterwards I'm going to ask Aaron his thoughts on what he's hearing about, you know, our anecdotes. So with me, I'm going to share with everybody a little bit of a show and tell story. Is one of the more disturbing experiences that I had, and it was in response to actually our law firm. We opening up back in 2007. Thank you, Steve, for bringing that up. So we had really good press coverage, and here's an article from the Chicago Tribune. We got an outpouring of response from that. And in addition to the positive that we got, which was a lot, it was a lot, we also got some hate mail. And we got an ugly hate mail letter from a very disturbed person. Yeah, Steve, thanks for going to this particular page. You guys can read it on your own. I'm not going to waste my breath on it, but you can get a picture of what it's saying there. At first, I thought nothing of the letter. The guy had included photos from the newspaper clipping. He doodled turbans on our heads and beards on us. And what I initially thought was some kind of christening on our foreheads with crosses. And we were just like, yeah, whatever. And I was in the office and I was holding the photos and I dropped them and I went to pick them up. And for some reason, it just clicked when I looked at them. I was like, oh my goodness, these aren't crosses. These are crosshairs of somebody who's wanting to shoot us point blank. What is that about? And that was really disturbing. So we took a look at this, we took a step back and we said, okay, if anything, we're doing something right, because we have so many letters and phone calls of support. And we're also doing right in seeing this, because it's telling people there's a place and a space for Muslims in America. So what did we do? We reported the letter to the FBI, we beefed up our security, and we plowed forward. Here we are in 2024, we're going to be pushing, I don't know, 30 years in a few years, 20 years in a few months, a few years. So that's my little story. So, and this is the scariest part about it. You know, where are you from? That kind of question. Even the what you eat, what you drink, that kind of stuff is one level, but it really gets escalated when it hits home with like what Junaid was saying, being beat up. No kid is entitled to being beat up. And what Jinan was saying about, you know, the surveillance and the mobs around the mosque, really? So now I'm going to turn our attention over to Aaron, and what are your thoughts on this? You know, you're hearing this coming from the African-American perspective. I'd like to hear what you have to say.
Greetings, and thank you for the invitation. I often make comparisons in my class when we discuss race to gender. And I mention how when women leave a building when it's dark, they're always conscious of the fact that it's dark outside, whereas men often never give it a second thought in terms of what time it is that they leave a building. And the point of that is that you can know someone, sleep next to someone, you know, be in a family with someone and literally have absolutely no idea about what they go through in terms of their identity on a moment-to-moment basis, whether something's happened directly to them or not. And I think that's something that people don't understand when it comes to a group dynamic in terms of that level of anxiety. So when people mention something that happened in Vermont, it's not where you lived, it's that it happened and could happen to you, right? And people in these communities understand that the threat is enough to cause this level of anxiety and stress, and on a moment-to-moment basis impact your life. So a lot of people see a little clearer when it comes to gender as far as what they see and are able to understand than what they're able to see in terms of race and religion. And in terms of the institutionalized component of it, which I'll talk about briefly now and a little more later, is one of the examples I gave a group of studying principals. They were asking if there's anything I can give them, in parting when I went to speak as a consultant for the principal program. And I thought for a while, and I said to them, you could stop playing hangman. And the room just went silent because all of them play hangman. And I said, you can't fathom the level of ahistorical cultural insensitivity that it would require for you to use extrajudicial murder to teach children how to spell. And I told them, go on your phones, check out the App Store, type in hangman, hundreds of apps. This is the level of blindness that we're dealing with in terms of I can see it when it's me, or I can see it in this instance. When it comes to somebody else in just a slightly different context, I'm completely blind and ignorant, right? Sometimes willfully, sometimes otherwise. And with that being said, with the last minute or so, I just want to share where I come into the conversation in terms of allyship, because I've always said in terms of race that this allyship should not be performative, and there has to be risks involved, because if you really see the true connectivity, between what other people go through and what you can, actually go through, I think that's important. So I'll just read some of the email that I brought up without naming any names, but you know where I work, so that's that. It says, this is just from a student who wrote, who remain nameless. Among the challenges I've experienced thus far, I did not anticipate the volatile and extreme atmosphere of divisiveness and toxicity. I am a Muslim woman who is very uncomfortable being in a program with an extreme Islamophobe. I left 2 courses because of her antagonistic ways, and upon discovering this video, I do not believe I can be successful in this program at all, given the present climate. I am being treated differently because of my religion, and it's originating from said person. So I wrote to the administration at the university that the university has been made aware of these concerns by students, administrators, and faculty members. Many have attempted to advocate for students who feel discriminated against while working to ensure non-discriminatory departmental leadership and faculty and not unprofessional harassment. One quote from the video, if you're wondering, the video that was mentioned, it says, we keep embracing Islam. We keep on calling our children Muhammad and Aisha and Yasir. We keep on going to Mecca. We keep on not eating for 30 days. Follow Ramadan, whatever. We keep on praying to their God. Nothing annoys me more than brothers and sisters in the United States, telling me Assalamu alaikum. And then I wrote in response to all this information to the administration as a faculty member and as a human being, I feel misrepresented and under great duress from the university appearing to be complicit in this undeniable religious intolerance, yet remaining supportive of said person. And those are my opening statements, and I can talk more about other things later.
And you brought up some really important issues, allyship, being a proactive bystander, because you can easily have just turned away and just said, this is your problem. And you didn't. And like you had prefaced, taking a stand and taking a stand involves risk. And that's risk aversion is what many people try to avoid. They don't want to risk losing their job, making waves and so forth. But we have a section for that. We'll talk about that in a sec. Before we get there, though, let's take a look at language, right? And terminology. Language, as for attorneys, plays a very central role in our lives. And so I want to take a look at defining Islamophobia and what the difference is between Islamophobia and anti-Muslim bias. So Saman, I'm going to start with you and have you define for us Islamophobia and explain how that differs, if it does, from anti-Muslim bias. So I'll give you the floor with that.
Yeah, of course. So, Islamophobia is the fear or aversion or discrimination against those that are Muslim who, practice the Islamic faith. But I think anti-Muslim bias takes it a step further. And it's a person acting in accordance with those beliefs, with those fears, but then also the stereotypes and myths that end up getting created about, people that are Muslim or those that are perceived to be from Muslim majority countries. And it's really, if you have this anti-Muslim bias lens with how you see the world, how you see people who are Muslim, and then attribute those stereotypes and myths to them, and that's how you treat them without ever getting to know that person and know whether they do function within that stereotype that you've heard of, that you've created about that person. And oftentimes it is the more microaggressions, it's the smaller instances that build up. And there's different layers of anti-Muslim bias. There's subtle, those microaggressions that we talked about, using phrases or joking or calling someone. A lot of the stereotypes attributed are being violent or, throwing around the word terrorist as if it's commonplace or common parlance with people who are of Muslim background. It can go up to within the infrastructure of how organizations work, whether they inherently, push out people who are Muslim or are practicing. But I think anti-Muslim bias is more subtle. And there are friends that I know who have faced anti-Muslim bias, but actually are not Muslim. But they're perceived to be. So those, I have friends who are Palestinian Christian, but have had that lens applied to them, even though they're not Muslim. So it does take it a step further. And I think the bias can sometimes be worse because we're not even aware that we're applying that bias to other people and acting in accordance with those fears or aversions or myths that we attribute to people that are Muslim.
So let me ask you this follow-up. How can one become aware if we're not aware?
Yeah, I think part of it is having conversations like this. I think part of it is organizations have a responsibility to have cultural competency questions the same way you may have gender bias towards someone, and forcing yourself to be more aware of, are you making this decision or treating somebody in a way because of their faith or their perceived faith? Are you, the two most common ones that come to mind again are you saying that this person is inciting violence because they're brown, they wear a headscarf, they appear to be Muslim, or is that truly what's happening? So I think it's asking yourself the question of, am I acting in accordance with, placing this lens of anti-Muslim bias on this person? But it's a very active process of asking yourself those questions. Is that what you're doing when you're evaluating this person in front of you?
And a lot of times we don't want to take that deep dive look into our hearts, right? For fear of what we actually see. But that's the best way to grow and to learn, to become better. Erin, let me ask you this. In terms of Islamophobia, now that we have a working definition of it, is this, I mean, you kind of touched on this, but I want you to kind of dive a little bit deeper. Is this a Muslim issue, or can it be an everyone issue? And if it's an everyone issue, why? What makes it an everyone issue?
Well, it's definitely not a Muslim issue, because I say all the time to my students, do not own anybody else's sickness. They don't do it to me because I'm Black. They do it because they're racist. They don't do it because you're a woman. They do it because they're sexist. So I would never take ownership of anybody else's discriminatory behaviors. But I would definitely say it's an everyone issue. I always know what type of meeting it is because it's usually the victims of said discrimination who predominantly occupy the meeting, unfortunately, when the people who really need to be in those meetings and in those spaces and in those conversations, listening, right, not being centered, but being present, are never there, right? And I see it. We had a group, women organized against rape, war in our community. I worked for the Philadelphia Anti-Violence Network, and we'd always know when they were meeting because it'd be all women. It's the only meeting where it's all women, where men are the problem, right? And we have similar situations with race as well. So I think not only is it not the problem of those predominantly victimized, it's disproportionately the problem of those perpetuating the discriminatory behavior. And I heard somebody say earlier how exhausting it is, right? To be tasked to not only endure the discrimination, but then to provide solutions for it, especially in spaces where those primarily responsible don't want to be present or even acknowledge the existence of the discrimination.
And Junaid, Janaan, what do you guys have to add to this? Anything?
What I could add is that, being asked to be the solution to anti-Muslim bias is really it's a real problem, and it's it just goes to show how little people understand what it feels like to be the victim of other people's racism or discrimination. You know, I'm very active in various bar associations, and you know, when I point out racism or bigotry against Muslims, one of the first questions I get asked is, "Oh, well, did you reach out to that person?" And my response now is, no, I didn't reach out to that person, because that's not my responsibility to give that person a platform to explain and minimize what they've done. It is patently anti-Muslim, so the association needs to figure out how to address and tackle that situation. And if part of the solution is to talk to that individual, then you know, somebody else needs to do that. But I, as a person who is affected by the bigotry, should not be then saddled with the responsibility of you know, rectifying it on his own.
All right.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I think the panelists put that really beautifully. And just to add to the terminology aspect, because I think people can get lost in words, and we're lawyers, so we love words. But I think in essence, like Islamophobia, what's important to realize that it appears in both overt and covert ways, right? So it could appear like Saman said, like abusive language, physically being violent towards somebody. But also for us, the ways it usually appears is very overt. And in ways that sometimes is legitimized by law. So indirect violence towards Muslims through surveillance, through racist policies, watch lists, through this free speech exception to Muslims. So it can be in varying degrees, but for us, it's usually in this kind of overt way, or sorry, covert way of biases, of these like discriminatory practices in the workplace and in the law as well.
So one thing that I've noticed, kind of turning our attention now to civil rights issues, and seeing this through that particular lens, is if we take a look at civil rights in the United States, you know, it started off way back when, you know, hundreds of years ago, where who was inside of that little circle of protection? It would be that white, wealthy, Anglo-Saxon male, okay, and then everybody else was outside of it. And the good news, or I should say promising news, is that I think it's fair to say it's expanded over time since then, but we also have to acknowledge that it's contracted as well. And so I see it as a two-step forward, one-step back approach. Sometimes it's the opposite, but it does slowly expand, all right? When it comes down to contractions, one thing that I've noticed, it can be the impetus behind it can be something like when our country is under attack. So I'm thinking President Lincoln, he suspended habeas corpus, right? World War II, and we had, you know, the Japanese internment camp. Not one Japanese who was interned was found to be a threat to the United States, but no, we have to round them all up. Immigration, where there's an immigration wave. I remember seeing signs in my history books of, you know, we had a large group of Irish who come and says, Irish need not apply for in front of businesses, you know, for people who are wanting to look for work. We have, of course, involuntary immigration, which would be, you know, the African slave trade. And then when these two things occur together, it kind of forms a perfect storm. And so what I'm thinking here, we had a wave of immigration from the Middle East, from starting in the 1940s and 50s, and then 9/11. And what came from that? We have the Patriot Act. We have the NSEER system. For those of you who don't know, it was a national registry where Muslim males of the age of 18 to 25 here in the United States were required to register with the federal government. We had systemic surveillance systems, like those undertaken by NYPD. And as Jinan had mentioned, surveillance of her own mosque. So, you know, in this situation, maybe it's 2 steps forward, 3 steps back, right? what I want to do now is to elevate our analysis from anecdotal experiences to data-driven analysis. So, Saman, what does the data say about the state of Islamophobia in the US?
Yeah, so CARE actually in there, so CARE is the Council on American Islamic Relations. The report from 2023 showed that the amount of reports was at 8,061. Those are the complaints that they received as one organization about anti-Muslim bias and hate, and those are across the board, whether that's, you know, asylum immigration cases, whether that's workplace discrimination cases, hate crimes, etc. And just to put that in perspective, that's the highest number that they've seen since 1995. And for context, in 2021, the report that they published, they received 5,000 for the year. Now that 8,061 number, half of those came from the last quarter of 2023. So I think it's really interesting. The title of the report is the resurgence of anti-Muslim hate, and I think it's very accurate in that anti-Muslim hate is resurging. And they actually just published today, CARE published today, that in the first half of the year, the first half of 2024, they've already received 4,951 complaints, and that's up 70% since 2023. So if you compare the first half of 2023 to the first half of 2024, it's clear that there are more hate crimes that are happening against Muslims. We're seeing the numbers are exceeding what they have in the past. And it's very evident that, you know, the hate is being, I think to some degree, sometimes it is quiet and people are being more emboldened to show that hate, to act on that hate and act on that bias that they have.
And I'd like to ask Junaid, you know, in the legal industry, because, you know, you've been in practice for what, probably 20, 30 years?
30 years.
Wow, man. So, you know, looking back, you know, are those numbers, what do you think about those numbers? You know, was it just something that wasn't reported back then, or you know, assuming that they were equally strong then as they are now? Or is this something that is on a rise? What are your thoughts there? And actually, I'd like for you to tap into bar associations as well and how they approach Islamophobia from your experience.
Sure, I can tell you. So I believe that whatever numbers, whatever data we have, like through CARE or FBI and DOJ monitoring hate crimes statistics, that whatever numbers we have, those are underrepresenting what's really happening out there. That's something that I can speak to from personal experience. You know, when we were growing up, with the exception of you know, when our windows were shot out, and maybe the first or second time that my brother or I were subjected to, like, you know, like a beating, they just stopped reporting it because they, you know, they realized nothing was going to happen. Nobody was going to be held accountable. And so they took the, you know, keep your head down and, you know, just gut it out. And that's literally how we did it growing up. And then as a practicing attorney, before I became an administrative law judge, I you know, worked as a practicing attorney. And there are so many instances where people would call to get advice because of, you know, some type of bias, bigotry, violence that was perpetrated against them. And when you give them, you know, the advice that, look, the first thing you've got to do is call the police. We've got to report this. There's a reluctance to do that because they are afraid of the repercussions of, you know, bringing this into a law enforcement context. So many people avoid trying to raise this issue if it's like in an employment setting because they're afraid not only is nothing going to happen to rectify the problem, but there might be retaliation, you know, for me raising this issue of bigotry against me. So those are some of my observations on that. And like, there's more to talk about, but I'll save some of the rest of it for later.
Okay, actually, you reminded me of a case that I had in which my client reported, he was Muslim, and he sued this company for not just race discrimination, but religious discrimination. And he reported 4 times discriminatory actions that were taken against him. The first one, and then retaliation, and he got dinged when he was asked, well, and there were other things other incidents that he brought up, but he didn't report them. And he got dinged by the employer. Why didn't you report them? He's like, to what extent? It's ad nauseum. Okay, here he comes again, doing another report. So, there is that delicate balance that a person has to kind of like measure, has to weigh in their heads, like, to what, for what purpose am I doing this? Is it worth doing it? And, the small actions don't get reported, but they're still hurtful, right? They're still there. It's just that we're not going to report them. So I hear what you're saying about underreporting. Jinan, you're Palestinian, as I understand, half Palestinian, right? Am I understanding that correctly? Yeah, and visibly Muslim. Now, a little bit of your backstory for our attendees. You were going to launch your legal career with Foley and Lardner. This is a firm with 1,100 attorneys in 25 offices worldwide. Now, what was it about this firm that gave you the impression that this would be a good fit for you?
Yeah, for sure. I think when I was accepted to or offered a position at Foley, I was ecstatic. I wanted to be a good lawyer. I wanted to be a good litigator, and to absorb that knowledge and skill that Foley had to offer. But most importantly, the reason that I applied to Foley and accepted the offer was because of Foley's supposed commitment to diversity. Especially, again, I told you all my experience growing up in Bridgeview, and just being constantly the target of a lot of Islamophobia. I really wanted to be at a firm that not only cherished diversity, but really want to uphold it in every way. So Foley was a firm that prided itself on diversity and inclusive value. But however, I was targeted as one of the only visibly Muslim woman in the law firm, in the office, Chicago office. So I think for me, why I went to Foley, again, a prominent law firm, but mostly because of the diversity that it uphold.
Okay, so you've also been a longtime supporter of Palestinian human rights, and after the October 7th, 2023 attack on Israel by Hamas, you spoke out about Israel's indiscriminate bombing of civilians of Gaza at an October 11th meeting at Chicago's City Hall, and also through posts on your personal social media account. On October 22nd, the day before you were to begin at Foley and Lardner, the firm then rescinded its offer and you subsequently sued. So in a nutshell, what's the basis of the lawsuit?
Yeah, for sure. And I think it's important to contextualize what that time and the devastation meant to us. People not only from that region, but really Muslims in general and everybody that cares for human rights, of seeing literally children being torn apart. I was going to funerals, I think, every 2 days of families that had 30 members of their family just decimated in Gaza. Funerals right here in Bridgeview of people that had family back home, being worried for my own family, waking up every single morning with the screams of children and mothers looking for pieces of their children in the rubble. So speaking in City Hall, speaking out against this violence on my social media was never a question. It was something that I had to do and exercise kind of this privilege of being in the US and having the right to speak and exercise my First Amendment rights. So after, again, in late October, I was called into a meeting by the head partners at Foley and Lardner, asking that we've been seeing everything that you've been doing on social media and we need you to come into the office for a meeting. And when I heard this, again, these are people that I know, I worked with. So I was honestly like really excited to have an open conversation, really have a teach-in of what it means for me to be a Muslim at this time, especially with family in the region, and really use it as a teaching opportunity, like I mentioned. But unfortunately, that wasn't the environment at all. And it was a very hostile environment in which I was asked a series of questions about my support for Palestinian rights, my involvement in Students for Justice in Palestine, even asking about my father and where he works. And he works at our local mosque, and my background and identity. And I remember them pulling out, again, like almost a packet of screenshots of my social media, of my speeches, and interrogating me about it line by line. So ultimately, they framed my advocacy for Palestine as supporting terrorism and singled me out as one of the only visibly Muslim young women in the law firm nationwide. And I think something that I always go back to that makes me quite emotional is that in this meeting, I remember for about 15, 20 minutes describing how worried I was for my family in Gaza and how, every morning I'd wake up and I'd check if certain members were alive and how difficult that was. I remember to that kind of like really laying my heart out there, I was asked, well, do you condemn? That question that every Muslim is asked, do you condemn? So I think, especially for Foley, a firm that prides itself on diversity and inclusion, and using, again, this trope of Islamophobia, of framing anything that Muslims do as supporting terrorism. And this standard was not applied to other colleagues that spoke out about the conflict or spoke out even and advocated for Israeli violence. So for me, it was very difficult and to kind of, I almost felt betrayed, and people that I know and that prided themselves on diversity and inclusion to throw me away like this, and to not support my background and kind of the immense toll that the time was taking on me, and ultimately firing me again for speaking up for Palestinian rights.
Is your situation an anomaly, or is this something that's more ubiquitous with big law?
Yeah, this is a great question. I think after I was fired, I really sat with it for a while, just to kind of understand what happened. I was completely taken back. And while I was processing this, I also heard about dozens of people and Muslims that were similarly fired, or had their offers revoked. And this is especially in the legal field. So I knew that this couldn't crumble, and this wasn't really just only me, but this was part of a broader pattern of attacks from people who express support for Palestine. So I think from the murder of 6-year-old Wadi al-Fayoumi to the shooting of three students in Vermont to the attacks on employees and students, it's very clear that we're seeing kind of a post 9/11 resurgence, and the US's foreign policy is creating a very dangerous environment for Muslims in the US. So this is when I really thought about it, and I went public with what happened to me and decided to pursue legal action because I wanted to make sure that people who looked like me, and who advocated for their community, for their family, and just for human rights in general, were not treated in this way, and to set a precedent that law firms cannot continue to target or discriminate against us without accountability. And honestly, since I've gone public with my story, I've received dozens of messages of people who have also had their offers rescinded, also been discriminated against in the workplace. So that was really important for me, that even while dealing with all of this and the trauma that inflicted, but also making sure that I was setting a precedent that people who look like me and Muslims in general we were not going back, right? We're moving forward.
So taking a look at bar associations, Junaid, you are involved with the leadership of the Illinois State Bar Association. How has your experience been in terms of Islamophobia and the ISBA?
So yes, I'm active with the ISBA in various roles, and I had a recent experience where we're seeing an uptick of Islamophobic rhetoric in some of the forums that the Bar Association provides, and this is no secret. It's a public forum, and the commentary that's being posted is really negative. So I would say that the overall response of the Bar Association is finally positive, but it takes a Herculean effort to get it to that point. I wrote an article that I wanted published in the Diversity Leadership newsletter for the ISBA about the fact that some of the dialogue, some of the discussion taking place in ISBA chat rooms was Islamophobic, and that this didn't represent what the organization stood for. That dialogue definitely didn't represent the leaders that I knew in the association, and that it's important for us to address that. And I was very disappointed that the article was pulled without actually being published, without actually being discussed with the editors of the newsletter. And this is an important point. I've been practicing law for 30 years now. I've been through a lot in my life, and so there was no way I was going to take that lying down, and I pushed back hard, and I used all my relationships and networks, and just said, look, this dog's not going to hunt. You can't just shut me down like that. But there, and kudos to Jinan for having that same mindset, being a new graduate. But I'm afraid that there are a lot of people who would say, you know what, to heck with it. I don't want to fight this fight. I have other things to do. So what I found is that I had to do a lot of work on my end to get the article published and to start addressing some of these issues. So I think that bar associations are talking about DEI, but when it comes to Muslim issues, among others, the action doesn't meet the rhetoric.
And that takes me to Aaron. Action doesn't meet the rhetoric. Should we expect this as Muslims? Is this nothing new? What thoughts do you have?
Well, interestingly enough, I would go to African American members of faculty and administration, and I've even communicated with members of the Muslim community in positions of prominence and at a university level and within the city, remain nameless. But I was under the impression that since people are part of a community, of course they're going to advocate. But like you said, the cost of speaking out when systemically there's institutional structures in place to punish people just for advocating for others or caring about people. I don't judge them in any way, but I was definitely surprised and dismayed that people who go through things similarly within their own communities can turn around and do the same things just based on similar fears of retaliation. So it's daunting and does take a Herculean effort, as was mentioned, but I think it's important for people who don't feel comfortable living any other way. And that's how I felt about the situation. I can't go around and talk about what other people should do in terms of race when I wouldn't do the same in terms of gender and religion. So I couldn't sleep peacefully at night, and I wouldn't feel good about the legacy I left, even just as a parent and a human being. So I think for those people, especially who don't really have a choice, because we wouldn't feel comfortable, we'd probably get sick physically if we just tried to sit and allow these things to happen on our watch without, doing something about it. So I don't really, think about the people in power, but I do encourage people to take their positions. That's what I always say to my students. Don't spend so much time complaining or get disenfranchised and embittered, but use it as motivation and tell people, well, not tell them, but think to yourself, this is the reason why I need to endure. This is the reason why I need to apply myself more and find like-minded people. I need to take these positions so that I can bring more humanity to these powerful and prominent spaces.
Right. So here we are. We know the numbers and the reality on the ground. Let's take a look now at how we can shape for a better tomorrow. As cliche-ish as that sounds, we always have tomorrow, and we can either stay where we are, we can participate in making life worse for others, or we can try to make it better, one person, one day at a time. So, Saman, I'm going to start with you, given your expertise in training and working with corporate America in terms of these issues. What kinds of tools are out there to prevent the growth or slow down the growth, I should say? I don't think we can prevent the growth of Islamophobia and anti-Muslim bias, but maybe we can slow it down. What are some of the tools that are out there, not just for corporations, but also for individuals?
Yeah, I think from starting broader, just for me, a lot of what the work I do is bystander training within anti-harassment training. And I make it a point to make sure that there are examples in there that are specific to people who are Muslim and certain situations that they may face in the workplace. So that's very specific to that particular situation when I get to do those trainings. I think organizations in general, though, should have cultural competency training, should have those conversations at the outset whenever they can. I think there's also the informal conversations do so much more, in my opinion, than the formal, this is how you should be acting in compliance with this law, the required, whatever. So having those informal conversations with people that that are in your circles. I've had friends that have done informal sit-in type educational conversations, where they talk about experiences that they've had, similar to how we talked about at the beginning of this call, experiences that they've had, and what somebody in that situation who is a bystander could do to provide allyship. Because honestly, most people just aren't aware. They aren't aware of those situations that somebody might be in. And even if they are, they might not know how to react in real time. So even providing suggestions when you're having those informal conversations, like, oh, it would have been really nice to have had someone say X or step in and intervene in that situation. I think Junaid, you had mentioned it earlier, a lot of the DEI part, the rhetoric that exists doesn't necessarily come into play. And I think it's a shame that a lot of the DEI policies that exist are either one, feel like they're a front, or two, people are pulling away because of the backlash on DEI right now. And I think it's really important to make sure what your values are as a person or as an organization are generally being followed through with. So they're not just words, they're actually actions put into play. And I will plug the EEOC because they do help a lot of organizations with creating these types of trainings at a very low cost, and help organizations be able to do these types of trainings. But I think at the most basic level, it's having conversations with people, and having conversations with yourself to check your own biases.
Myself, no problems with myself. That's what I think is honestly one of the greatest barriers. There's no problem with our corporation. There's no problem with myself. How do we overcome that? You see what I'm saying? It takes that person with self-awareness to say, I need help. But what if there is no self-awareness? I think, Junaid, you're kind of like, you have something to add to that, or would you want someone to finish up the thought?
I wanted to just add one thing really quickly, is that I agree with Saman that it's those conversations that are very impactful, but there are some things that we need to do a better job of educating ourselves and in the legal community, in our employment spaces, and the bar associations, and in every other aspect of our civic lives. And that is that, what constitutes Islamophobia in the formal DEI training, because I think that doesn't always make it in. And the reason for that is because at some level, I think there needs to be, like a level set for people that, certain things are they are Islamophobic. For example, to ask any of us as Muslims, as a precursor to any discussion, do we condemn, this, that, or the other, violence perpetrated by co-religionists around the globe, is inherently Islamophobic, because it places an onus on us as individuals for the actions of people halfway across the world. And so in those examples like that needs to be incorporated into formal DEI training, that this is an example of what is Islamophobic, so that we don't even have to respond to questions like that. So I just wanted to add that.
Right. And to Aaron, in terms of metrics, are there any metrics that are out there that says that this kind of engagement does work with bringing down bigotry and hatred? Is there hope for us?
Oh, definitely. I had a class on sports and leisure, and we talk about entertainment. We look at the film Real Bad Arabs, and they talk about like 1,000 films and 936 having negative depictions. And, even recently on Joe Rogan's podcast, there was a gentleman talking about watching Peter Pan with his son. And his son was 10, and the whole "Why is the red man red?" the son picked it up right away and says to the father, Dad, this is pretty racist.
Mhm.
So I'm thinking, 20, 30 years ago, we were so thoroughly indoctrinated and conditioned, institutionally, that these subtle messages about who's important and who's of value and who's normal and who's a full human being, goes under the radar. But now it's happening, but people are calling it out. A great example on a college level is when the Boston bomber got the cover of the Rolling Stone, looking like he had an album coming out after murdering all those people. The college community was like, this is ridiculous. There was an awakening where people are a little more critical in terms of their analysis. And they were recognizing that for some people, no matter what they did, they couldn't reach the status of fully human. And for other people under this current system, no matter what they did, they were always a boy gone the wrong way or a lone wolf or, turned, all that all things we hear when it's a white man committing a violent crime. So I do think that people are starting to become more in tune with the nuanced ways and the subtle ways that people are taught to devalue other people and make it seem like it's of none of their own doing, and it doesn't make them a worse person in any regard. For us, in closing, when we get a message within like 10 to 12 hours about one community internationally, and then like 4 weeks go by and we get like a Charlottesville both sides letter from like the same university president, it's very clear, to everybody involved, the urgency and the value of people and how it needs to change. And I think the more alert and in tune to these discrepancies and disparities that students and young people are, the world will change accordingly.
Okay, so I'm seeing that the time is at 5:32, and we did promise about 20 to 30 minutes for Q&A. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to wrap up the formal conversation with actually a poem that came to my attention way back in the day when I was doing a lot of talks on Islamophobia, and it's titled How to Create an Enemy. And this is by written by philosopher Sam Keen. So let's go ahead and pull it up and I'll read it for everybody. I'm not a big poem person, to be honest with you, but this one just really caught my eye. It was up for a second, but then it went down. Uh-oh.
I see it.
You see it? I don't see it. Huh. All right, well, let me see. How about you, Junaid? Do you see it?
Oh, now it's down.
All right, there we go. So this is the beginning of the poem. Start with an empty canvas. Sketch in broad outlines the forms of men, women, and children. Dip into the unconscious well of your own, that's just too, there we go. Now we're to the second stanza. Dip into the unconscious well of your own disowned darkness with a wide brush and stain the stranger with a sinister hue of the shadow. Trace on the face of the enemy the greed, hatred, carelessness you dare not claim as your own. Obscure the sweet individuality of each face. Erase all hints of the myriad loves, hopes, fears that play through the kaleidoscope of every finite heart. Twist the smile until it forms the downward arc of cruelty. Strip flesh from bone until the only abstract skeleton of death remains. Exaggerate each feature until man is metamorphosed into beast, vermin, insect. Fill in the background with malignant features from ancient nightmares, devils, demons, myrmidons of evil. You will be able to kill without guilt, slaughter without shame. The thing you destroy will have become merely an enemy of God, an impediment to the sacred dialectic of history. That's How to Create an Enemy by Sam Keen. So on that note, I'm going to open up for Q&A, and then at the end of Q&A toward the top, we will talk about our call to action, which has to do with answering the question, I will lead and activate diversity by, and fill in the blank. So I'll give you guys about half an hour to think about that. But in the meantime, we do have a couple of questions here, and I'll go ahead and get started. It seems like there are several in this first one, and it's for Jinan Chehade. Does Janaan understand that the First Amendment does not limit a private employer's ability to refuse to employ an individual whose opinions the employer finds offensive? So there are three questions here. Does Janaan consider it Islamophobia for an employer to expect an unequivocal condemnation of Hamas and October 7th? And then third, does Jinan understand what Hamas is? I think it's supposed to be that Hamas is a terrorist organization, and does she consider it Islamophobia to recognize this? Do you want me to do each question one by one, or do you want to just kind of group it all together? It's up to you.
We can just group it all together, I think.
Go ahead, you have the floor.
Yeah, so the first one is more, I think, a question about my case, my lawsuit. Of course, I'm a lawyer, so I understand that First Amendment does not apply to the private sector. If you are interested in knowing more about my lawsuit or complaint, you can find it online, where we cite social discrimination based on religion and national origin, and promissory estoppel. But for us, I think why it was important to pursue this is because there was a clear double standard. Again, me as the only visibly Muslim hijabi woman in the law firm was interrogated in this manner, and that her advocacy for her people, for her community, was construed as terrorism, while others that were again advocating for Israeli violence against people in Gaza were not interrogated, nor were they fired or called into a meeting. But if you're really interested in knowing more, I would love to send you a link to my complaint. And then to your second question, of course, that's not Islamophobic, but I actually explained this in the meeting, so I'm glad you brought this up. But I think it's Islamophobic when we ask Muslims to condemn every sort of attack or crime that is committed in the geopolitical sphere. I think an interesting way to really think about this is whether we ask Christians to condemn the KKK or other, because obviously there's this presumption that does not represent the religion as a whole. And I think speaking about this point, it's really important to understand that even these questions and the way they are framed, honestly, is the same defensive mechanisms of construing everything that I said as a way of how can I get back, you know what I mean? So I think really this introspection is needed of, we never mentioned Hamas or October 7th. What we're talking about here is Islamophobia. So it is not Islamophobic to ask somebody to do that, but to ask somebody to do that in a space that has nothing to do with that conflict in itself is Islamophobic. And then to your last question, does Jinan understand? Yes, that Hamas is a terrorist organization, and does she consider Islamophobic to recognize that, or Islamophobia to recognize this? Again, I don't want to reiterate myself too much, because I think getting lost in what we're trying to say here, and that Islamophobia itself comes in very overt and covert ways. And for me specifically, it came to when people were not able to see my humanity in this way, and I was cast aside when trying to advocate for my people. It had nothing to do with more so the intertwined of the politics, but more so the broader picture of how are we humanizing each other and Muslims in this space. And I think the last thing that I'll say upon this, because these questions, I assume that they were coming, but Jinan, I know, asked me what were the repercussions of me filing my lawsuit. Here are the repercussions: that everywhere I go, I'm asked the same questions over and over again. I get daily death threats. Yesterday, somebody messaged me that I hope your kids blow up and you find pieces of their limbs in the rubble. I get emails and physical letters to my place of work sent saying that I'm a terrorist, I'm a garbage person. I only got into Georgetown Law because of my diversity. And on top of all of this, I lost my job and I'm having trouble paying rent and supporting my family. So when we said all this and these kind of questions come up, it's really time to go back to the beginning. of how did we get here? You know, this is the same question I asked, how did we get here? How are we not humanizing each other? And this is especially important in the legal field. I'm not sure if everybody here attending is attorneys, but we often think about the law as disconnected from what's happening in the streets, or the shooting of Wadia, or even my own firing. But this could not be further from the truth. We, the law, are shaped by society, but also shape society. Discourse and the law is the highest form of change. It is the ultimate codifying force in the path towards justice. So if we, as lawyers, again, as masters of this moral code that this country is grounded in, are not able to understand each other and these varying forms of threats to our justice system, how do we have any hope of implementing it? So to the person asking these questions, I'd really ask you to think back about what we were saying and to humanize each other, to ask around, because to read past the headlines, because none of this happens in a silo. The shooting of 3 students, a 6-year-old boy being stabbed 26 times, dozens, if not hundreds, of Muslims being fired in the past 9 months did not happen in a silo. It is all interconnected with each other, but is also interconnected with our different movements. The last thing I'll say about this, and I apologize if I'm going off because there are multiple questions I see coming in. When I was fired, the only solace that I had was looking at different movements, specifically the civil rights movement and the Black Panther movement. And I learned from different allies that during the civil rights movement, Black people were put to be framed as this domestic enemy creation, right? As this domestic threat. So it was easier to attack them, to harass them. And what is the first thing that Muslims are called? Terrorists. It is all this otherization that we have to work against, because truly injustice everywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. And in order for us to counter it together, we must bring all our understanding, all our movements, all our pain that our communities are facing, and address it together.
Would anybody like to add on top of that? Go ahead, Junaid.
I would like to just point out that you know, as someone who has worked intersectionally on preventing hatred and bigotry and addressing that, you know, I've learned a lot about what it means to be hateful or bigoted towards other communities. And I believe that it's pretty safe to say that if I were to ask one of my friends or neighbors who was Jewish whether or not he or she condemns X, Y, or Z act of the state of Israel, that would clearly be anti-Semitic, because it would presume that I'm imposing on that person, because of his or her identity as a Jew, a responsibility, a shared responsibility for any bad acts of the sovereign state. And so this notion that Muslims have to answer for the acts of any entity that that we have no control over is, yes, Islamophobic. And the fact of the matter is that over the course of my lifetime, it's Muslims among other communities that always it's minority communities, it's disenfranchised communities, of which Muslims in America are one, that have to constantly you know, approve ourselves as worthy of citizenship. It's not granted to us. It's not, our sense of belonging isn't a given the way it is for those who have other privileges. And so, yes, asking us to constantly condemn X, Y, or Z is clearly Islamophobic, because we don't walk around, as I think somebody else said, asking our Christian colleagues, our Jewish colleagues, our Christian and Jewish and Hindu friends and neighbors if they condemn the hateful movements that are inspired by people who happen to share their faiths.
Yeah, you remind me of Timothy McVeigh in the Oklahoma City bombing. Nobody went around asking the average white person, do you condemn it? No, because of course you do, right? So I see where you're coming from. Junaid, the next question is for you. Is it Islamophobic to ask everyone to condemn Hamas, in parentheses, in other words, or i.e., not to single out Muslim employees? Or is Junaid's point that Muslims have a right as a matter of free exercise to support Hamas?
So what I'm going to do is I just preempted the question with my previous answer, and would point out that the question is inherently Islamophobic.
Mm-hmm. And then we have thank you to the ABA and all of you for holding this program. I'm grateful for you grateful for you for discussing this topic. I'm appalled by the legal communities, especially the civil rights and nonprofit communities' silence over the occupation and genocide in Palestine and Gaza. Let us all be more courageous and live up to our duty to uphold the Constitution and end white supremacy everywhere it is found. To Janaan, thank you for your extraordinary courage. I suppose I should ask a question. How can we, as public interest attorneys, encourage our organizations to be more courageous in the face of political pressure? And actually, I'm going to guide that toward Saman because this happens to be your field.
Yeah, I think honestly, asking your organizations to hold either trainings, conversations, if you have an organization that gets behind the people that are actually a part of it and is representative of those people, that's what starts those conversations. So honestly, I would recommend going to whatever your human resource department is and saying, you know, we want to have these conversations. We want to have either bring someone in, do a panel, do a sit-in, do an educational presentation about what it is that we can do and the people that are on the ground and how we can be of aid to them. But also internally, you know, there are a lot of diverse specific, you know, within an organization, they'll have groups that you can join. Like if there's one specific to people that are faith-based or one specifically that is gender-based, a women's group, you know, Muslim, whatever. But having those groups, I think, is also helpful to be able to go to your organizations and say, hey, there's a group of us that exists and want to have these conversations and want to be able to support. And we want our organizations to do that. And I think with public interest attorneys specifically, there's a lot of, you know, volunteer opportunities that you can do. I think connecting with attorneys in the space who have resources that you can take straight to them, if you can suggest that to your organizations, I think those are all great ways to get the conversation started. But it's also, again, I feel like going back to just like the definition of anti-Muslim bias, it's when you have questions and asking those questions is not a bad thing. But I think it's when you come from a lens of hate, when you come from a lens of negativity, is when you really, like, that's the issue. And that's when you're applying that negative bias to those that are Muslim. But if you're coming from a positive standpoint, if you truly want to learn and understand, then it should be as easy as going to, in this case, your organizations and saying, you know, these are the conversations we think we need to be having in these spaces. And if we don't, we're doing a disservice to the legal community and to our organization.
You know, Erin, I'm going to ask for you to chime in because this is an interesting question because it's not just about how to be more courageous in the face of political pressure as far as political pressure with Muslims. I mean, this can go as far back with, you know, African Americans and the centuries of fight that they've had to go through. Can you build upon what Saman had shared? Is there anything more that can be done?
I think our perception needs to change, not just our level of empathy and ability to recognize other people's full humanity. Also, the normalization of discriminatory behavior is a problem even within my field. I was saying, based on the current political climate, you're going to hear a lot about 1920 women earned or received or were given the right to vote. And I said, you have to reframe these conversations and you have to let people know, especially young people, that in 1920 was when women and their allies successfully resisted the unconstitutional disenfranchisement predicated upon gender discrimination. So very different framing. People, as Chris Rock said, the comedian, people stopped acting so crazy. It can't be this, oh, we're getting better and growing from the previous place. No, we were totally off base and acting inappropriately, and we're working collectively to make it more perfect. I think Dr. King said at the mountaintop speech, just be true to, we're asking America to just be true to what you said on paper, right? And I don't know a lot about the law, but I did hear about these free exercise clauses and Lemon and Kurtzman and the Lemon test, right? And I know that this entanglement between church and state is problematic. Even saying church and state, shows, a little discrepancy, maybe political, religious institution and state, right? To give people a better understanding that there's not a universal standard to which all should, aspire, whether it's Christianity or whiteness or maleness. But I think the way that we frame these conversations, too many people view the world like it's a tug of war, a zero-sum game. I always say that race is not a zero-sum game, but racism is. And there's too many people out here, even according to what I'm seeing in the Q&A, that view the world as a tug of war and as musical chairs. And the problem with musical chairs is that there's not enough for everybody, and it puts people in a contentious posture. But it's also done by design. And I think that people need to look at it more like a beautiful, diverse symphony. Because when you go to those operas, nobody's pushing or shoving because everybody has a seat. And I see that in a lot of, communities that are well-to-do, as opposed to maybe a North Philadelphia community. And when I explain it that way to my students, they start to get it. When they get dropped off in North Philly, their parents are telling them, watch out, the way that these people are. But when you understand the different history and the different treatment and the different conditions that people live under, then it makes perfect sense that people would behave differently, speak differently, and have different concerns, even in terms of, like somebody said earlier, calling the police, right? Not to bring up Sonia Massey, but there's these parallels here where people from certain communities don't feel protected, don't feel safe. And then, like you said, they're dinged later for not speaking out. And this whole structure of, did you go to your abuser? Did you go to the person that violated you? Needs to change institutionally. This needs to not be an HR standard for people to say, once you're done wrong, you go back to that person, and it's your responsibility to not just fix the situation, but also fix that individual or individuals. So I think a massive reframing, to change institutions, to change people's hearts, but also to change the structures of how we deal with situations when they arise. And I'm very optimistic because I see a lot of change, just 5 years ago, and people mentioned 9/11. There's a lot of, positive outcomes. And I'm definitely an optimist in this regard. People always marvel that I'm a racial optimist based on what I know. But when you look, far back, you see there's a lot of progress being made. And I think when people are able to not be gaslit, you all did a great job. When I saw the Q&A, I was like, oh, for real, but when you can keep on the task and on point, and I always say to my students, don't let the haters fool you, let the haters fuel you.
So we have a comment from Honorable Judge Nichelle Johnson. She asked if this is being taped. She came on late. I said, yes, it is being taped. It'll be on YouTube in about a week from now. She says, I happen to be a Muslim judge in New York State, and this topic is so important. New York State has a working group of judges that have sponsored some Islamophobia programs recently. I'm so happy to see the ABA on this topic. So thank you for those comments. And then we have a response to Junaid with what your comment was. And I think I'm going to pair these two together. It says, Junaid asserts that any question that is inconvenient is Islamophobic. That answers the question. And then the next question is, how can you begin a conversation when you start with the premise expressed in a previous question that Israel is a white supremacist nation? So Junaid, I'll have you answer to that first question and then begin the conversation on the second one. So the first one has to do, Junaid asserts that the question that is inconvenient is Islamophobic. That answers the question. What is your response to that?
If a question or a statement is bigoted in any way, then it is. Now, as someone pointed out, that doesn't necessarily mean that the person asking the question is a bad person. They may be coming from a position of ignorance. That doesn't change the fact that a bigoted statement is a bigoted statement. And so there should be space and grace for conversation and learning. But one thing that I've learned over the course of my life, not just the 30 years that I've practiced law, but the 54, 55 years that I've been on this earth, is that the time for being apologetic and apologistic is over when it comes to me and my faith community and my allyship with other minority communities. When it's bigotry, I'm going to call it out as bigotry. And we can have a conversation about it. And I can tell you why it's bigoted, but I'm not going to apologize or soft pedal it.
Okay. And as to if anybody else would like to comment on how can you begin a conversation when you start with the premise expressed in a previous question that Israel is a white supremacist nation? How can you begin a conversation when you start with the premise that Israel is a white supremacist nation? Okay.
I don't think I understand the question.
Yeah, we'll move on.
I do
So
really quickly, Janaan, want to say that I think that, again, part of this presentation and the purpose is to bring light to, the idea that Islamophobia is real. And it is occurring currently. And I think some of the questions that we're receiving does the topic a disservice when you're not truly recognizing that, Islamophobia is real. And I think it goes back to the conversations we were having earlier where anti-Muslim bias is very real and alive. And it's a disservice to take away from that conversation and not recognize, again, not just our own anecdotal, the data that we've talked about, but the real reason that we're having this conversation is to have these conversations and combat that Islamophobia and anti-Muslim bias that gets applied to, people at large, but also us as, as panelists.
And then there was a question that was posed to me: when you describe Israeli bombing as, quote, indiscriminate, what is your factual basis for that statement, or is that othering? That actually came from the complaint that was written on Chehade's complaint. And I will say that it is indiscriminate, because if you just take a look beyond the headlines and you read the articles that are out there, then you'll see that bombings of hospitals are indiscriminate. Bombings of where people live indiscriminate. The numbers themselves of nearly 40,000 civilians killed is not targeted. Go ahead, Junaid.
I think we do ourselves a disservice when we allow people who post these questions anonymously to derail the conversation. This is not a forum for that discussion. This is about how we work against the legitimization of Islamophobia. And when we allow individuals like that to derail our conversation, we are enabling the legitimization of Islamophobia. So I'm not going to speak for anybody else, but I'm going to refrain from answering any more questions about those issues and focus on the widespread and long-standing Islamophobia that exists in the United States, and what I believe is going to be another resurgence of that as things unfold over the course of the next several months. And think about how we can come together to lead and activate diversity, including for the Muslim community.
So we're nearing the top of the hour. We just have one really good question that just came in. So I'm going to try to extend things maybe by a minute or so. Can you speak to the efficacy and acceptance of the UN recommended definition of Islamophobia, which is different from the definition that Saman mentioned in this discussion? Saman, do you want to answer that one?
Let me really quickly pull up the UN one so that I can actually speak to it.
And that's fine. What we'll do is we'll start with our wrap up, okay, of I will, of the charge that has been given to us, which is the call to action. By finishing the statement, I will lead and activate diversity by, and then fill in the blank. And so we'll start with the youngest one in the group. That will be Jinan. So why don't you go ahead and fill in that blank? How will you lead and activate diversity?
Yeah, I thought about this for a while, but I think this conversation even re-ingrained how important this is. But I suggested that I will lead and activate diversity by being brave enough to open my heart to truly listen. Because I think sometimes it takes courage and bravery to truly listen and to not be defensive. So that's why I kind of want to leave the audience with today, to challenge yourself to really, read past the headline, to challenge yourself to come together in community, to break your heart and care for this and to come together, because the world, again, does not need more lawyers. We need more lawyers who care and are willing to combat racism, not only against Muslims, but all groups, because again, this is all our fight and all our struggle.
All right, and we'll pass the buck over to Erin. How will you lead and activate diversity? Oh, we can't hear you, man.
My apologies. To lead with love and always be willing to have difficult and uncomfortable conversations, especially when they're made in good faith out of ignorance and not attempts to gaslight or create a straw man defense. I think it's also really important that people see the fear and insecurity, in a lot of the whataboutisms, right? As African American, we saw this all lives matter thing. This whataboutism is, on fire when it comes to certain communities having the center of a discussion or occupying certain degrees of space and being centered is like, it's not accepted, right? Some people can have a conversation about what they want their way from their perspective. Other communities, the second they even begin a conversation, they have to be mindful of the attacks that are going to try to pull them into centering other people within their conversations and the gaslighting and whataboutism. And I think just staying steady, through those kind of attacks and recognizing that, for people who are used to privilege, any semblance of equality feels like oppression. And people are scared. And I used to say, if you ever been fishing, when the fish comes out of the water and it starts flapping around, the one thing you don't do is lay down and flap with the fish. If you want to save it, you put it back in the water. If you want to eat it, you let it die. But when I see the fish flapping, I don't get crazy because I'm not a fish. So I'll leave it at that.
Okay, Junaid?
So I would say that I will lead and activate diversity by continuing to stand shoulder to shoulder with the minority communities and the communities that have been historically disenfranchised, and work to achieve for those communities everything that I want for the communities that I identify with, and ask them to work with me to achieve those for my communities.
All right. Now we're going to kind of go back one step and have you answer that question. I'll read it one more time. Can you speak to the efficacy and the acceptance of the UN recommended definition of Islamophobia, which is different from the definition that you mentioned? And would you just share with us what that definition is that the UN had and then your definition?
Yeah, absolutely. So we had a more general, broad definition of a fear. Go back up. An irrational fear or aversion to discriminate against Islam or people who practice Islam or those who are who are Muslim. And currently the recommendation from the UN was a fear, prejudice, and hatred of Muslims or non-Muslim individuals that leads to provocation, hostility, and intolerance by means of threatening, harassment, abuse, incitement, and intimidation of Muslims and non-Muslims, both in the online and offline world, motivated by institutional, ideological, political, and religious hostility that transcends into structural and cultural racism, which targets the symbols and markers of being a Muslim. And I think in a more specific sense, the UN recommended definition is more specific. The one that we had offered was more of a broad, just to parallel or compare to what anti-Muslim bias is. And I think a lot of them honestly work hand in hand. When you are functioning from a place of Islamophobia and applying that anti-Muslim bias lens, that it does result in it. I will say people do have a lot of questions in terms of whether or not you can apply Islamophobia to those who are non-Muslim. And I think, we talked about how it is possible to perceive someone to be Muslim or someone who is advocating for those who are Muslim to face Islamophobia in a sense as well. So I think they interplay the definitions that we have and the definition that the UN has recommended to adopt definitely interplay with each other.
Right. And then how will you, what is the prompt again? Lead and activate diversity by doing what?
Yeah, and for me, I think it's, you know, coming from a place of understanding that, and Junaid kind of mentioned this, that people may come from a place of ignorance, but having those conversations and putting myself in places where I can contribute and have those conversations with people, and staying true to the values that I have while also engaging in discussion that will promote and continue diversity.
All right, and I will bring in the rear. I will lead and activate diversity by engaging in conversation and learning about others. There was this reminds me of a bumper sticker that I once read. The mind is like the mind is like a parachute. It only works when it's open. I'll do my best to keep my parachute, my mind open. All right, folks, on that note, thank you so much for joining us. I would like to go ahead and, of course, share my gratitude or show my gratitude to the ABA's GP Solos Diversity Board for putting together today's webinar under the leadership of Dana King and Kelly Adams. I also thank the ABA support staff for making our webinar so possible. That would go, of course, to Steve Wildy and to Kim Koshin. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us tonight. Have a great evening. And then this will be available online on YouTube in about a week or so. Thank you. Y'all have a great evening.
Thank you. I believe Henry's going to close us out.
We can't hear you, sir.
Thank you for giving me the opportunity to close this out. Again, I won't cower from the question. I will activate diversity by recognizing that hate predates each of us. We were born into some of these environments, and I'll recognize that hate survives because it thrives in silos. And I will activate diversity by attacking it regardless of the silo it resides in, whether it's the anti-Semitic silo, the Islamophobic silo, the anti-LGBTQ plus silo, the anti-African American silo, the anti-immigrant silo. We can only fight hatred if all the people who are subjected to hatred fight it wherever it resists. I hope you all enjoy the rest of the day. Please stay safe, and thank you for joining us. Bye-bye.